Good morning. This is the program on constitutional government in Harvard's Department of Government. And our guest today is Sean Wilentz. He's been a professor of history at Princeton since 1979. Before that, he graduated from Columbia and from Oxford for BAs and got his PhD at Yale in 1980. He's written a number of books and many, many articles. Let me give you just a few of the books that he's written. Chants Democratic in 1984, New York City and the Rise of the American Working Class. That sounds like his dissertation. Then a number of edited books, including The Rose and the Briar, The American Ballad, that was in 2004. The Rise of American Democracy in 2005, a much honored book with the Bancroft Prize. Andrew Jackson in 2005, The Age of Reagan in 2008, Bob Dylan in America, 2010, there's The Ballad again. A book of articles, I think, The Politicians and the Egalitarians in 2016. And most recently, his controversial book, No Property in Man, 2018. Slavery and Anti-Slavery in the Nation's Founding. He's working on a sequel to that, which is the Triumph of American Antislavery, which would be coming after the anti-slavery in the founding period. And the title of his talk today is Anglo-American Origins of Atlantic Anti-Slavery. So Sean Wilentz.
You have to unmute yourself.
I just did that. It's all set. Thank you very much, Anna. And it's delightful to see everybody even under these circumstances. I'm going to give you a talk today, which is going to be, as I was explaining to Harvey, I've been writing a great deal about things that have nothing to do with this book I'm writing right now, or tangentially connected. So I'm seizing this opportunity to actually get back to my own work and talk a little bit about the Anglo-American origins of anti-slavery. The book I'm writing, it's meant to be a kind of, I don't know, Gesamtkunstwerk, a kind of gigantic operatic history of anti-slavery from, origins through the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. It's really a companion volume to the book that I published in 2005 called The Rise of American Democracy. I see the two as very, entwined. They're two different angles on the same period, the same story in American politics. And my hope is to be able to tell the same, almost exactly the same period to the year in a different way, from a different angle. To see, and people who look quite heroic in volume 1 may not look quite so heroic in volume 2, and vice versa. But to try to take these two themes, democratization and anti-slavery, which are, I think the major themes of American history, at least, through the Civil War, to put them in counterpoint, to put them up next to one another, and then see what we get. And I'm hoping eventually, if I, go long enough, I'm not even gone gaga, to write a third volume, which will be a kind of synthesis of the two. That's what I'm doing these days. It's meant to be a political history as well, very much concentrating on politics as opposed to the more social history aspects of that. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is give you a very quick run-up, some background on the problem of origins in talking about Atlantic anti-slavery. And then I'm going to inflict upon you, so I'm going to read actually some bits about a very interesting man named Samuel Gorton, who I hope none of you has heard of, in Rhode Island in the 1650s. And if anybody, has anybody actually heard of Samuel Gorton? I'm just looking out over everyone in my Benthamite style. No, I hope not. Okay, good. So I'll be reading a little bit of that, coming from what I hope will be the early portions of this book. Okay, so a little bit of background, just to sketch it out. The story of the origins of Atlantic anti-slavery are, I think, quite tangled and confused. They really haven't been sorted out to my satisfaction. I mean, in some recent accounts, you may have read, it would seem that anti-slavery, Atlantic anti-slavery kind of was born in the famous Somerset decision in Britain, Lord Mansfield in 1772, which supposedly so frightened American slaveholders that they, started the American Revolution, which was essentially a pro-slavery revolution. And that's the origins of Atlantic anti-slavery. A lot of problems with that. Starting with the fact that there was no anti-slavery movement in Britain in the 1770s, really until 1787. Secondly, that the very first anti-slavery society in the history of the world was founded in Philadelphia in 1775. They got the story kind of backwards. That origin story just is a non-starter. It's not going to work. There's an older story, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar, which dates the beginning of anti-slavery in 1688 in Germantown, Pennsylvania, just outside now part of Philadelphia, when a group of Quakers, they didn't publish it, they wrote out the first written anti-slavery protest, certainly in America, in 1688, so that the origins of anti-slavery seem to have a lot to do with Quakerism. There's a bit of a problem with that as well, more than a bit. First of all, it has some of these, it resembles Parthenogenesis. I mean, it really is a story as it's told that all of a sudden, boom, out of nowhere, no fertilization had to occur. This thing just sort of came out of Quakerism, whatever Quakerism was in that corner of Pennsylvania in 1688. That can't be true. There has to be something before that. Something was brewing before that we have to take account of, and that I'm going to have to take account of in this book. It also ignores the fact that in fact, while this protest, the Germantown protest, was in fact written and delivered to the local assembly in 1688, it was basically ignored. They didn't pick up on it. It wasn't even discovered until the 1840s. It was delivered and forgotten about. There were struggles within Quakerism, but it took a very long time for the Quakers actually to tell their members that they should not hold slaves anymore. It took until the 1750s. There was a struggle. It's an interesting struggle. It did not really involve the main line of English Quakerism. It was more these sort of odd antinomian types who were pressing for anti-slavery. So the 1688 origin story really doesn't hold very well either. So where do we go? Well, where I go is to the history of slavery itself. I mean, if we're going to understand what the history of anti-slavery is, what was the history of slavery? What was the history of Anglo-American slavery? That was the first point. And the second was, I was reminded, in one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, at one point, Lincoln, who was, of course, excoriating Stephen Douglas for his complete callousness, his racism, his indifference to the institution of slavery, says that the choice is between the common right of humanity and the divine right of kings. That's the way he puts it. Now, that's not an accident, I think. Not an accident at all. I think that the history of anti-slavery is bound up with the rise of Anglo-American slavery, in the rise of Stuart absolutism in the 17th century, in the resistance to Stuart absolutism in the 17th century. That is the place where you see this stuff beginning to appear. Not originally predominantly aimed at getting rid of slavery, but is part and parcel with the larger resistance to revolution against Stuart absolutism, and therefore, eventually, as we know, in the 17th century, against all kinds of things. What I began to realize was that what we have going on in the 17th century and then on into the 18th century in particular are really two revolutions. We've gotten used to, ever since R.R. Palmer back in the old days, we've gotten used to talking about the period from 1750 to 1815 or so as the age of the Democratic Revolution. And somewhere anti-slavery figures into all of that, although not as much in Bob Palmer's old book, but more and more in David Davis's studies of slavery. But it's all part of the age of the Democratic Revolution. I think that's mistaken, or rather, I think that there are really two revolutions going on. One, the revolution that we're all familiar with that leads into the French Revolution, American Revolution, the French Revolutions, all the rest of it, Latin America, all over the place, against hierarchical monarchy, against aristocracy, all the things the American Revolution fought against. And there is also an anti-slavery revolution. And they are occurring side by side. They're occurring at the same time. They're closely entwined in many ways, as I hope to persuade you today a little bit, but they're also quite distinct. You know, it was entirely possible to be, you know, strongly anti-monarchical and be pro-slavery at the same time, as the state of South Carolina, you know, is eloquent tribute, right? By the same token, you know, you could be a rebellious slave in this during the Revolutionary War and side with the Royalists, to side with the British. So it's not a one-to-one correlation, nor does the achievement of republicanism, democracy, the achievement of American independence, it does not assume that slavery will end, right? One is going to end earlier than the other, obviously, but they're not exactly the same thing. And the victory of one does not assume the victory of the other. I want to make that clear. But by the same token, that they are combined. All right. So in developing this idea of two revolutions, a quick sketch, first of all, you know, just so everybody has it in mind, of, you know, of how slavery came to be in this country, in this part of the world. And here I'm relying very heavily on some really important work, which I hope you will all become aware of. I'm going to, you know, announce them, especially work by a woman named Holly Brewer. I don't know if you've run across Holly Brewer's work or not, but I commend it to you very highly. She's been writing particularly on John Locke and you know, sort of British liberalism and slavery and anti-slavery in this period. And then a man named John Donahue, who has written heavily on the things that I'm going to be talking about, particularly having to do with 17th century English radicalism and the origins of anti-slavery. Okay, all right. Having given my footnotes and my gratitude to them, just a sketch of where slavery was. I mean, slavery really begins in 1603 as very much an adjunct of what's going to become Stuart absolutism. I mean, it's James I and Charles I who implant slavery in Virginia and then elsewhere in the colonies. Very much with the institutions, very much what an outgrowth of their ideas of royal dominion. Slavery originates not simply as as the ownership of one person by another, but with an entire, infrastructure, an entire constellation of laws, assumptions, et cetera, that are very, very closely tied to what the Stuarts are introducing at the beginning of the 17th century, and then even more so after the Restoration. It's not as if the end of monarchy is going to end all of that, as we know under Cromwell. The Western design, Cromwell does take Jamaica. Slavery is not inimical to Oliver Cromwell, but it is the case, nevertheless, that slavery, as we conceive of it, 17th century slavery, going into 18th century slavery, racial chattel slavery, truly only begins to be instantiated in the colonies after the Restoration in 1660. With the formation of the Royal Africa Company, a series of court decisions. I won't go into that entire history, but it's really then that things begin to take shape as we know it, okay? How does anti-slavery fit into all of that? At the moment, and I'm very eager to hear what you think of this, among other things, but at the moment, I'm thinking that there are really two strands to anti-slavery at the end of the 17th century, leading into the 18th century. One which is recognizably liberal, and it's one that emerges after 1688, because it's the fact that while the Stuarts have been doing what they were doing after the Glorious Revolution, William actually cracks down on the institution of slavery as best he can. He suspends the involvement of the monarchy, of the crown, in the slave trade. He's going to give it to private people, but he's trying to extract all of that. He also revises the Board of Trade. And here's where actually John Locke comes in, and Holly Brewer's work in particular. Over the last, how many years? 30, 40 years, there's been a great deal of work which basically says that Locke and the two treatises are the foundation of liberal pro-slavery thought. There's a sort of direct line somehow between John Locke and John C. Calhoun, you would imagine. Instinctively, that can't be true. But historically, in fact, it isn't true. What one finds is, first of all, go back and read the two treatises. His justification of slavery on the basis of just war, as you find there, which is usually used as the telltale passage in the two treatises. It's very abstract. It has nothing to do with how slavery as it actually existed. Whereas Locke had a lot to do with slavery as it actually existed, because thereafter, as a member of the Board of Trade, under William's, aegis, he does a lot to try and undo the headright system in Virginia. He does a great deal that is, in fact, much more in line with what is going to become anti-slavery activity. So that's one strand. And where we go from Locke getting up to Montesquieu and the Enlightenment and all the rest of it, that is something that is yet to be filled in, but that is certainly one strand that I can see out there. The other is much more radical, and the other is tied to earlier events in England, particularly, well, in the 1640s. I mean, it has to do with the English Revolution. It has to do with the world of, I suppose, the world of Christopher Hill as much as anyone else, in shorthand. Because the very first declamations against slavery in this world, in what is going to become the Anglo-American world, pop up right in the 1640s. At least the earliest that I can find. And if anyone knows of anything earlier than that, I would very much like to hear about it. But I have been unable to track down anything before that. It starts bubbling up in, what are going to become parliamentarian and anti-monarchical radical messages. A man named Henry Parker, who was not a minor parliamentarian in the 1640s, in 1644 directly attacked the institution of slavery as it had developed under the Stuarts, calling it violent, noxious, and involuntary. These are things that to him were marking slavery, as opposed to the slavery they were charging that all monarchy brought. This was something distinct. He was attacking the institution of slavery, not under the general rubric of dependence or tyranny, but as chattel, racial slavery, as you saw it, quite chattel slavery. There are more indications of this in the 1640s into the 1650s. And we're getting back to those in a second. Most kind of dramatically, actually after the Restoration, or just after the Restoration, in London, the Fifth Monarchy men, who you probably have heard of, no doubt have heard of, there's a great deal of anti-slavery declamation coming out of the Fifth Monarchy men, and they have a revolt in 1661. You may remember that's, very shortly, briefly, the Stuarts repress it quite violently, actually, in London. But one of the hallmarks of that rebellion, or that uprising, it's more of an uprising than a rebellion, was their anti-slavery. They are pointing to anti-slavery as a particular reason that they have to, that not only have to overthrow the monarchy, but the millennium will eventually come. All right. There are other indications of this much more radical kind of anti-slavery thought. It, however, is of course repressed. In 1660, and not only the Fifth Monarchy men, but that whole branch of English radicalism is basically forced underground. And anti-slavery is as well. It's harried to the very ends of the empire. So edges of the empire. So in fact, when you do see anti-slavery thought kind of cropping up in the 1670s, it's in places like Barbados. It's out actually where the slavery actually is. But you hear, George Fox visits Barbados in the 1670s, and he makes sort of vague anti-slavery points. It is repressed, but it is going to come back, and it's going to take root again in the New World. Okay, and that's the story that I'm going to try to tell. All right, that's the background. Now I'm going to read something brief, or I hope it's brief, not too long, about a gentleman who I will show you. Whoops, can I do screen sharing, Anna? Can you enable me to do some screen sharing?
If somebody can tell me where to do this, I'm not sure I've ever.
If not, it doesn't really matter. I had a picture of Mr. Gorton that I wanted to just show people, so you can get a sense of who this guy is.
Middle of the bottom. should be a,
Let me see if I can
icon.
do under more, enable. If I make you co-host, could you, does that already work?
If I can, if there's anything I can do to, yes, that'll
Yes,
serve.
co-host is the way to do it.
Okay, so now you are a co-host? Oh, no, that's Paul. How did you?
Not yet.
Yeah, Sean, now you're a co-host, I think.
Now I'm a co-host. Okay, let's see what happens. Very good. All right. This is the gentleman I'm going to be talking about. This is Samuel Gorton. I don't know when this was painted, probably, certainly before he comes back to America in the 1650s. But you can tell by the dress and so forth what kind of character he is in the context of the English Revolution. Okay, I'm going to stop the share there, and I'm going to get myself out of this view into a smaller view, and I'm going to pull up. You should be able to still see me, but I'm going to pull up the text that I'm going to deal with. Can you all see me fine? Is that right? Hello?
Yeah, we see you well.
yes, we
You see me
can.
well? Okay, that's all I wanted to know. Okay, so I'm going to be reading, bear with me, I'm going to be reading this and hopefully not being too distracting. We're going to talk about Samuel Gorton. This is Samuel Gorton in 1652, probably shortly after the portrait that I just showed you was painted. When Samuel Gorton is 60 years old. And at age 60, he had lived through more than a lifetime's worth of agitation and persecution. Raised in England in better than decent comfort, well educated in languages and in English law, Gorton, who was described, he was a clothier, and he was also described as a gentleman, but nevertheless a plain gentleman, as you can see from that portrait, was drawn to radical Protestant ideas. And in 1637, he had left London for Boston with his wife and young family, determined, quote, to enjoy liberty of conscience in respect to faith toward God. His faith came to center on his belief in the essential divinity of all human beings, saints and sinners, and in conversion as a demonstration of following that inner divine spirit in the face of all human authority. I mean, here, this is the antinomian streak. Consonant with emerging radical currents in England, Gorton's theology made him a heretic in Puritan Massachusetts, and never one to cower, he paid the price. Described by neighbors as a truculent, bitter, even mutinous man, one person put it, who regarded civic officials with contempt, Gorton was repeatedly jailed, at one point whipped, and successively ordered out of Plymouth, Portsmouth, and finally the whole of Massachusetts for various alleged infractions of the peace, and above all for his heterodox religious views. He did have a following of fellow dissenters known as Gortonites, who in time formed their own settlement along the Narragansett called Chalmoet, on land purchased from a local Indian chief. And it's important, he purchased it. This was not expropriated, taken away. He actually made the deal. But in 1644, having been dragged back to Boston and condemned as, quote, a blasphemous enemy of the true religion of our Lord Jesus Christ, and having then barely escaped a death sentence, Gorton sailed back to England, better off in England than in Massachusetts, determined to secure justice for the abuses that he had suffered. All right. Over the next 4 years, this is 1644, over the next 4 years, as the political crisis between Charles I and Parliament worsened, Gorton managed to win some favorable official judgments about what had happened to him in Massachusetts, and actually gained the protection of the Puritan Robert Rich, who was the second Earl of Warwick. He also became a prominent figure in what was known as the Coleman Street Ward, a very important place in the more radical end of the English Revolution. It was probably the most radical religious precinct. It was the most radical religious precinct in all of London, where his fervent teaching touched a chord. His fervent preaching touched a chord with levelers, New Model Army clerics, and future Fifth monarchists. The place was utterly unlike the intolerant Stuart England he had departed a decade earlier. And amid the heady mix of politics and radical religion, Gorton's spiritual egalitarianism sharpened into denunciations of human hierarchy of every kind, from clerical privilege to the subjugation of women. He was sort of full of himself too. Lovingly embraced wherever I came, he wrote, with his usual immodesty. He finally departed England, his personal mission completed, with, quote, the people giving thanks to that God, he's quite a guy, thanks to God that ever such a word had been uttered among them. Okay. No shy violet, Mr. Gorton. Yet while Gorton remained an enemy of man-made inequalities, rather, his previous scorn of government gradually fell away, so long as that government was democratic in form and spirit. Okay, what he's picking up in the Coleman Ward is there could be something else. There could be something different. Shortly before Gorton reached home, Chalmette, which would be renamed Warwick, as we know it today, in honor of Gorton's benefactor, had joined with 3 other settlements in a joint government that would be, quote, and this is the word, democratical. That is to say, a government held by ye free and voluntary consent of all or the greater part of the free inhabitants. It is among the earliest descriptions, if not the first, of an American government as a democracy. And less than 3 months after he arrived, Gorton agreed to serve as magistrate of Warwick, one of the several government positions he filled over the next 2 decades. He became especially active as a member for Warwick in the Colonial Assembly. And in 1651, he was elected to the Assembly as the Assembly's moderator, basically the presiding officer, right, of the Assembly. Now, to this point, New England, although not like Virginia, markedly hospitable to slavery, had hardly banned the practice or generated much anti-slavery sentiment at all. I mean, in a famous letter to Governor John Winthrop in 1637, the schismatic Roger Williams had pleaded that captured Pequot Indians be spared, quote, perpetual slavery, but that did not preclude the enslavement of Africans. The Body of Liberties in 1641, the foundational code of laws for Massachusetts, outlawed, quote, bond slavery, villanage, or captivity, but established slavery for, quote, lawful captives taken in just wars. And this is where the references to Locke kind of come in, but that's much later on. Lawful captives taken in just wars, as well as, quote, such strangers as willfully sell themselves or are sold unto us, crucial, or are sold unto us. Although the code's discomfort with human bondage was palpable, and although it opened the way for slaves to be incorporated by conversion and manumission, it was the first explicit legal recognition of slavery in the English Atlantic world. In 1645, magistrates of the Massachusetts General Court, nudged by a petition prompted by a case involving an African slave trader, refused to regard the captive Africans in question as property and expressed, quote, indignation against the heinous and crying sin of man-stealing, completing successfully the first attack of its kind on the Atlantic slave trade in English history. Yet despite the court's judgment and despite the relative paucity of Africans yet in the region, well-placed New Englanders could not help wondering how they might partake of the immense profits being made off of enslaved African labor in the West Indies, particularly in Barbados, particularly in Barbados. One scheme suggested to Governor Winthrop to his brother-in-law, Emmanuel Downing, in 1646, would have involved capturing Pequots in, quote, a just war and exchanging them for African slaves in Barbados. Let's see if this is going to work now. This is not working now. Hang on a sec. My thing is not quite working. Okay, very good. So they're going to capture, that's the proposal, to capture a bunch of Indians and sell them off for Africans who were in Barbados. It was thus all the more remarkable when, on May 18th, 1652, I suppose a date which would live in not infamy, but celebrated, on May 18th, 1652, the Assembly Commissioners of Warwick and Providence, under moderator Samuel Gorton, passed the first legislative measure in the English Atlantic world. Indeed, I believe, and again, I want to figure this out, I believe the first legislative act in modern history, as opposed to a decree from a king or something, the first legislative act to abolish slavery. If I'm wrong about that, I want to be corrected. The order began with a sweeping recognition that there had arisen, quote, a common course amongst English men to purchase Africans so that they might, quote, have them for servants or slaves forever. To bar that practice from their community, the law prohibited chattel slavery for, quote, black mankind, unquote, as well as any bond servitude for blacks or whites extending beyond 10 years or after the servant was 21 years old. Any master who failed to comply with the limit, as well as any who sold them elsewhere, that they may be enslaved to others for a long time, would forfeit a heavy fine. I think this is important. I mean, against the immense force of imperial slavery in 1652, or the growing force of imperial slavery, this law was a pinprick. But against the immense weight of slavery's millennia, as reinvented in the New World by the Stuarts, it was a landmark, extending, I believe, the English radicalism of the 1640s and 1650s to the abolition of chattel bondage for, quote, black mankind. In defiance of Western ideas dating to antiquity, Gorton and the Rhode Island commissioners declared that freedom for some could not tolerate, let alone require, the enslavement of others. Now, this is an anticlimactic little presentation, for there's no evidence that the Rhode Island Ordinance of 1652 was ever enforced, and it would soon enough be a dead letter, along with the General Court's earlier condemnation of man-stealing. And by the end of the century, turn of the century, slavery began taking hold in Rhode Island, stronger than anywhere else in New England, and that colony became one of the premier centers of the Atlantic slave trade in all of British America. Thereafter, here and there on the mainland, religious radicals like the English Anabaptist hatter and vegetarian Thomas Tryon published anguished descriptions of the cruelty and hypocrisy of wealthy, blaspheming Christian slaveholders. Some ideas that would prove essential to anti-slavery politics, above all the natural rights writings associated most closely with John Locke, had yet to appear. Slaves and indentured servants had joined forces against Virginia's rulers during the ill-fated Bacon's Rebellion in 1676-77, but the rebels' Declaration of the People of Virginia contained no objections to slavery. Anti-slavery critics, for their part, showed scant signs of countenancing slave rebellions, let alone of joining with them. Apart from efforts to bring Christianity to the enslaved, as the Quakers did in Barbados, there hardly was any contact between white anti-slavery critics and blacks. Still, a few of what I believe would prove lasting foundations of the anti-slavery cause did arise in the 17th century. Anti-slavery's origins owed a great deal to the radical ferment of the English Revolution, taking hold in the same plebeian circles that produced level democracy and fifth monarchist revolutionary millenarianism. Early critiques of slavery's sinfulness accompanied condemnations of absolute monarchy and the unchecked greed of monarchy's slaveholding and slave trading allies, men who, as one Morgan Godwin put it, worshipped money and profit. When Anglo anti-slavery finally did cohere, it did so in 1688, just as Stuart monarchy was collapsing, as part of a struggle inside of one of the only radical sects that survived the Restoration, neither in repressive England nor in the West Indies sugar colonies, but in Quaker Pennsylvania. And that's where I'm going to leave off this story, hoping that it was, of interest, and open it up to questions.
Very good. Very good. Maybe I can start with a question.
Sure.
How do you assess the relative importance of religion and philosophy in the anti-slavery movement?
But by philosophy, Harvey, what particular kind of philosophy or a particular thing, or are we talking about natural rights or? Yes,
Locke comes to mind.
Yeah. Okay. Locke and liberalism. Well, this is something I'm trying to sort out. Because clearly they're both there. The religious stuff is not the only thing that's there. Also, what's interesting is that a lot of what is seen to be purely religious protests against slavery, there isn't much religion. There isn't much religion in them. Now, they're talking about a much more secular idea of equality. Where that's coming from, I don't really know. I mean, you see it as early, in fact, as the Germantown petition in 1688. I bid all of you to read it. It's not terribly religious. However, you know, the second treatise hadn't been written yet, so they weren't getting it from John Locke. But they're clearly coexisting. The point that I mean, I know the end point a lot better than I know the history to that point of how we're going to, how am I going to get from Samuel Gorton, you know, to the American Revolution. What is clear to me is that anti-slavery really only begins to cohere and take off in the 1760s. And it does so in large measure, and you know, this is running against the grain of what I suppose I'm supposed to be saying, but it has a lot to do with the work of one man. And that one man is Anthony Benezette, who is, to my mind, the greatest anti-slavery philosopher and agitator of his day. And you've heard of Benezette, along with John Woolman, the kind of you know, the Quaker seeker and traveler, and goes to the South and writes a very famous journal. Benezette is the great agitator. He writes to everybody. I mean, he's a one-man, you know, Atlantic Enlightenment practically. He knows, he is the Rolodex, I suppose, you know, that would be the envy of any, you know, Enlightenment thinker. But in Benezette's work, it's very clear that he's combining the two. And in terms of relative, what is more important, I think that he's, you know, quite, what should be situational about that, depending on who he's writing to. But he is very dexterous and very capable of not simply using both kinds of arguments, but in actually fusing them. I think in the end, when you know, I'm going to have, if not a chapter to Benezette, you know, a good long section on him as kind of fusing these two strands that I've outlined, and whose history I've yet to fill in. I'm just giving you a little piece of it. So it's not a question of relative. They're both there for people's use, as it will remain from then on, right through the 19th century. Right. I mean, if we look at anti-slavery writings, you see these two lines of argument coming all the time. You know, Abraham Lincoln's going to rely more on one than the other. You know, the followers of William Lloyd Garrison are going to, you know, do another. They're both there. So I don't want to say that's one or the other. The skill of the anti-slavery movement, in fact, is being able to, like Benezette, you know, deploy them both. Does that answer your question, Hari?
Yes. Well, let me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
What about Montesquieu and the spirit of the laws? If you look at Locke, I'm looking at the highest level of liberal philosophy.
Right.
You look at Locke, and you're right. There's a denunciation of slavery right at the beginning of the two treatises, and then, but it is abstract.
Yes, it is abstract
and not very definite. Or no,
right.
Right. In the spirit of the laws, that's 1748, the first edition. Mm-hmm. There is a very long and explicit consideration of all the arguments for slavery, and each one of them is stated and refuted by Montesquieu, including a chapter denying that there's a right to enslave Negroes.
Correct.
Yeah. So I don't know of any more explicit or general sort of philosophical. There isn't much religion in the spirit of the laws, I can tell you.
It sure isn't. No, look, you're absolutely right. And Montesquieu is a touchstone, you know, of the secular argument, and in fact more than Locke, right? I mean, in many ways. I mean, people are referring to the spirit of the laws, Benezette among others. Although Locke is in there too. I mean, it's not as if he's excluded. But because, you know, Montesquieu is so, what should we say, straightforward, so clear cut. Indeed, in talking about Negro slavery, or I forget what the word is in French, words are in French. But yes, the question I have to figure out is how, you know, where do the French come in, and how does it, you know, where is Montesquieu coming from? And I am just getting into all of that. So I don't have an answer for you yet. It's out there, I am sure. People have no doubt written about it, but that piece I've yet to put in. But Montesquieu is important, and you know, look, this is a multi, what should we say? This is a transatlantic and trans-channel movement that we're talking about, right? That takes shape, and it's not going to be confined to any one place, and it is going to be all over. And the correspondence back and forth is going to be swift and rapid, and lots is going on. So, I mean, one shouldn't lose sight of that at all. And the French are very much a part of it. The French are not going to be a part of the politics of it until we get to the revolution. They are late in that respect. But philosophically, they're there before, many Britons are.
So we have a
that's
follow-up. I'll just ask a follow-up question in chat from Avi Nelson. Was there any parallel or connected anti-slavery movement in Europe and especially in Africa?
In Africa, I couldn't answer yet. In Europe, this is what another strand that I have to follow up. Because in Germany and in actually in the Netherlands, some of these what should we call them, hot Protestants, people not unlike the Puritans. There are all sorts of sects. The Mennonites are an example. They begin to gravitate to the set of ideas. Now, how much of this is happening in Germany and in the Netherlands? Maybe in the Netherlands, but not so much in Germany. However, when they come to America, as some of them do, they become very important in what is often thought of as Quaker anti-slavery. The Germantown petition, for example, in 1688, those are Germans. I mean, they're not English Quakers. And with certain Mennonite connections, they've actually, one of them is the father of one of them has founded a kind of utopian community in Delaware. It is much more coming from Europe, and those are European ideas. Once they inflect in the colonies, once they inflect in America, they take on a very strong anti-slavery character. And again, it's not just religious. It's also, they have a secular side to them as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a European origin story that I have to figure out. One has to figure out too.
So Jim Hankins, please, and then Bob Faulkner.
Yes, I wanted to ask about the issue of whether Christians can enslave Christians. It's a major issue in Europe in the early modern period, especially New Spain. There's a kind of conflict of interest between friars who want to convert the natives and the imperialists who want to exploit their labor. And I wonder if this also applies in the U.S. or the colonial New England context in the 17th century, that there's you can't enslave Christians. That's in Catholic canon law. It's against the rules. The Muslims also, by the way, have a similar rule that Muslims can't enslave Muslims. The Protestants have no such rule, or they don't have canon law, but they've got plenty of preachers who are saying that. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if that's really a flashpoint for the 17th century, the idea that we cannot convert these people and then turn around and enslave them. And the whole idea of exchanging Pequot Indians for African slaves seems to me a pretty nasty way of avoiding your responsibility. When the Puritans came to New England, they were over there to, one of the reasons that they came supposedly was to convert the Indians. The original motto of Harvard University was "Come over and help us," meaning come over and help us to convert the Indians. So I wonder if that's a big 17th century issue.
Yeah, it is an issue, but it's especially troublesome for the Quakers, who are missionaries. I mean, they want to convert as well. They're a converting sect, and there's an argument about it. I mean, there are some who think that you can. That is to say, or rather, that you should enlighten and bring religion just enough religion to this. This is in Barbados. I'm sorry, in particular, just enough religion so that they'll be quiet and they'll be orderly. But not whether you can actually go as far as conversion, that's a problem. And so there are actually arguments about this. They're not big arguments because we're talking about a very small community. But yes, it is an issue. And I mean, the Pequots really got the raw end of the deal. But by then, of course, they were, considered to be heathen that could not be, you could not, possibly Christianize them. So just, sell them off and that's the end of it. They're impossible to convert. So better to have, get some Africans out of them. I'm not answering your question as fully as I'd like to because I don't know enough yet. But it is an issue. among the Quakers in the 1670s.
Yeah, maybe Anna could ask the other half of my question about
Yeah.
the politics of this, because the politics is also very interesting, since the monarchists are arguing that they own power, and hereditary power is power that's owned, whereas the Republicans always say that their argument is that power should be shared and not owned. So that would seem to me to be also a way of undermining slavery. The idea that, as your book says, no property in man, but also no property in political power, and therefore no way to sort of turn human beings into mere chattels.
You've just said better than I what the nut of my argument is about this. It's precisely the crossover from power as opposed to property. That, well, power is property, right? And property is power. But yes, it's exactly what's going on, and you see it quite clearly in it's not a huge movement, but in the things that I found in the 1640s and 1650s. It's precisely that the argument against slavery is essentially a political argument.
Yeah,
it's essentially a political argument.
And it's also command versus persuasion, right? That's in the Republican tradition. There is never command. There's never coercion. It's always persuasion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now I've lost my thought. But just as slavery is a political institution, and not essentially an economic institution. I mean, this is the thing where all my colleagues get off, thinking about Eric Williams and capitalism and economics and so on. It's essentially a political institution, and they understand it as a political institution. And that is where the heart of it comes in. Now, they're also opposed to great inequalities, and they talk about greed and all the rest of it. I mean, that's certainly there. But it's greed that is made possible because of the political situation. So it's a political critique of slavery, essentially. And I think that's right. And that's where I'm going to find these two strands, matching up.
Thank you. Bob Faulkner.
You haven't mentioned, and we haven't mentioned Hobbes among the thinkers. I know that Hobbes had a considerable influence on people like Jonathan Edwards in the colonies. Is there? And he himself, in his own way, is of course a natural rights thinker. So I wondered if you've seen some influence of Hobbes.
Yeah. The short answer is no, but I wouldn't be surprised if he figures in, coming especially in Massachusetts. But I haven't seen it yet. I really haven't. It's Montesquieu above all, and then Locke to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much, natural rights theory, yes, but I don't know how much these English liberal or Puritan types are going to be, taking well to Hobbes for a whole bunch of other reasons. So I would be somewhat surprised actually, but I'll certainly be on the lookout.
Patrick Dowdall, please.
Patrick.
Yes. Recently, my wife, through Ancestry.com, heard that she had no Cherokee in her background, but she had Nigerian, Togo, and so forth, which has led to a fair amount of research and discovering some cousins that she was unaware of, that she has traced back to I think the late 18th century. And some of her ancestors were free, as they called them, free Negroes, and others were slaves. And sometimes there actually was marriage between the free and the slaves, where it was, if the mother was free, that was the name that the children took.
Right.
So it led to, how did this phenomenon of these free Negroes arise in North Carolina and presumably other states? And it appears that the Quakers were a big part of that picture. In fact, I think they mentioned a group of Quakers from Rhode Island. But anyway, they would buy buy the slaves. how does that figure into your picture? Because I get the sense that these free Negroes were the ones who started the churches in the South during the slavery days, which then became more or less a focus for
Right.
at least in the anti-slavery.
Right. Well, I mean, Patrick, when you say the end of the 18th century, roughly when?
It would be, I think it goes back to, at least as far as she has traced, probably about, I think the first person would have been born about 1770, 1780.
Okay.
And then it stops after that. She hasn't been able to.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, more in Virginia than in North Carolina. The American Revolution does have an impact. I mean, there is a rise in manumissions. There's an easing of the law. I know the story in Virginia much better, but there's an easing of manumission law. It was very difficult to manumit your slaves in Virginia for obvious reasons, but that loosens up right around the time that you're talking about. I believe the law is 1782. And so there is the growth of a free Black population that hadn't been there before. There's a great, rise, enlargement of the free Black population, precisely in the sort of the I want to call it the upper South, but yeah, North Carolina, Virginia, in through there, not South Carolina, but the upper portions of it as well. And then you're right. I mean, that's right. The Quakers are doing their best to try to, get people out of slavery as best they can, sometimes by purchasing slaves and then freeing them, doing all kinds of things. This is the other part of all of this is this, in the story that the big book I'm going to be writing is just the American Revolution and Slavery. It has an extraordinary effect, not just politically, but on the ground, and your family is testament to that.
Tom Palmer, please.
Thank you for undertaking this. I'd welcome a suggestion of a persuasive book that I could give to my young friends who think slavery was invented in the Western world and in America, if you have your favorite like that. But my question is really, we do, all of us here, I'm sure, have our opinions of the 1619 Project as both as history and as journalism. But I wanted to just comment on that and its impact today. Oh,
yeah. Well, I'm kind of on record on this subject. What shall I say? I mean, my thoughts have evolved on it over time. At first, when I first read it, I was, prepared to see a kind of, one thing, and then when I read that the American Revolution was fought primarily to protect slavery, that's when I threw my copy of the magazine across the room. I mean, I just did. It wasn't a violent reaction exactly. I did go pick it up and read the rest of it. But, this is absurd. I mean, this is just factually absurd, let alone the fact I think there was and the reason was because the English wanted to close the slave trade. London wanted, the Crown wanted to close the slave trade, which is exactly 180 degrees wrong. Now, we professors can be nitpickers with journalists. They think of us as, being holier than thou or whatever. The American Revolution is a rather important subject in American history. And if you get the American Revolution wrong on the issue of slavery, then you've gotten American history wrong, as far as I was concerned. And while this is, a paragraph out of a much larger thing, it really appalled me, actually, because, it's the kind of thing that could have very easily been fact-checked. I mean, this is what fact checkers are for, right? So I got involved in it. I mean, as it happens, and there's an irony to this too. I was to give a lecture in Newark, and I wanted very much in Newark to give this lecture about slavery. And it was the Philip Roth lecture. So I was using a term that Philip used in Plot Against America about how things might seem inevitable in retrospect, but in fact, at the time, they seemed to be impossible to imagine. Right? I wanted to put slavery in that context, and I had sentence or two that criticized the 1619 project. But then I found out, to my surprise, that a number of my friends, good friends, had been giving interviews on the subject, much more loquacious and much more, detailed than what I had done quickly. And they were doing it for the World Socialist website, which is a Trotskyist website, which is not exactly the politics of my friends. Not that Trotsky is fine, but I mean, not these friends, right? Gordon Wood, Jim McPherson, my dear colleague with whom I taught for 30 years. And then and others, Jim Oakes, a few others. Not a Trotskyist in a lot, but the Trotskyists had their own reason for disliking the 1619 project. I think basically because I think of it as Stalinist. So we were back in it's 1936 all over again, and we're in the CCNY, and everybody's going to be yelling at each other, right? Because it's racialist, but it's also got a black nationalist thing, which the Stalinists picked up on. I mean, I can go into that part of the story. At any rate, they had their own agenda, but none of the liberal, or for that matter, even then, the conservative sources were really, some conservative sources, Newt Gingrich was up in arms, but I mean, the serious critiques had yet to take hold, right? So, I mean, any port in a storm, right? I mean, these are the people who are offering to do it, so you go do it there. And then it was on that basis that I wrote, I talked to them, my friends, and we just wrote a letter to the Times, simply asking for factual corrections, because there are two problems here. One is, the interpretive line that's being advanced by the project, but there's also just factual mistakes, right? You can't say the American Revolution was fought to protect slavery in the New York Times and not have a correction. Or that the slave trade, was something that the British wanted to, keep going, and the Americans, that the British wanted to get rid of, and the Americans were for. You can't have that in the New York Times, and not have a correction. So we just objected at that level. And then they replied in very, what should we say, ham-fisted, they knew better than we. And they had lots of other reasons why to prove what they said was true. So it's been, a brouhaha since then. That's my personal involvement in the whole thing. I mean, I think now, it was really kind of, I think, the beginnings of what we could never have imagined, because we didn't imagine what was going to happen over the summer of 2020. But it was a kind of early signal of a gigantic thing that's overcome the country, or it's been sweeping through the country, particularly in the university world, the college university world, ever since. And I think some of the, what should we say? I choose my words somewhat carefully. Some of the willingness of liberal institutions, and I use that word not in the strictly political sense, but what we think of as liberal institutions, to give way to this stuff has been, to my mind, quite disturbing and quite shocking. And but I approach it as an historian, so I'm simply interested in getting the history right. I'm not going to get involved in an institutional fight with people, because it's above my pay grade. But I think as history, I don't think it's going to, that stuff's going to last among historians. The silence from most historians has been, deafening. Very few people, have come up to support us. Okay, I can understand the intimidation on that score, but very few people have come up saying, hurrah, hurrah for the 1619 project. You just don't see it. So I think that in the end, it's not going to have the kind of intellectual impact that it might think it's going to, or that one might think it's going to. But I don't think that's going to happen. But that's going to take, keep on writing, keep on keeping on, as I say.
Even though schools are including it in their curriculum at younger ages. That
really disturbed me. That was the thing above all that disturbed me, was the idea that Chicago and a bunch of other places are going to be including it. They did manage to, it was a small victory in that it wasn't going to be the sole part of they weren't going to junk the regular curriculum in favor of this. They were going to put it alongside, which is, half a victory, I suppose, in all of that. But look, Abraham Lincoln's name is being taken off the schools in San Francisco because he's a racist. Things have gotten crazy. But I think that the specifics of the 1619 thing, from where I sit, will not last as a version of American history. Let's put it that way. You know, it will not become as they, I think, would have liked, the new narrative, or whatever the word is, master narrative, or whatever. I doubt it. I really do. Because in the end, you know, one of the things about historians, unlike, you know, other branches of the humanities, is that we do have facts, and we do kind of agree about facts mostly. And, you know, eventually the facts will out. That may not happen in literary criticism, for example, but it's certainly going to happen in history. And so I have a blind faith that will be the case. I mean, the thing that's upset me the most, you know, is nothing to do with the intellectual issues. It has more to do with, you know, I mean, you know, all of the intimidation that's been going on inside the universities. I mean, that's a drag, and it's stupid, and it's silly. I mean, the story that just came out at Smith, you know, have you seen the story in the Times about what happened at Smith? I mean, there are plenty of correlates for that inside the disciplines. You know, not having to do with, you know, somebody eating lunch somewhere where she shouldn't have, but having to do with, you know, the disciplines. And it's, you know, it's not good.
What was refreshing was that the Times looked in depth at the facts on that and told a counterintuitive version of what we'd heard.
The piece that it delighted me to see it. I mean, not from the standpoint that the story was so nice, but that the Times ran it, you know, and ran it in the way that they did. It was not not a mushy piece. It wasn't a he said, she said piece. It was pretty good. Maybe that's a sign that things are shifting too. You know, there's a lot of, I mean, now I'm not a historian anymore. Now I'm just a guy, you know, like the rest of us sitting at a bar just declaiming. So, you know, forgive me for doing that. But I mean, I do think a lot of it had to do with Trump. And I think that Trump really freaked out a lot of people and made things seem so desolate that, you know, this pessimism, this idea that America is essentially in a racist place. I mean, I think Trump had something to do with that. Trump's presence had something to do with that. Not that it should have, but it did. And it should have up to a point. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on. But I remain hopeful.
By the way, I think the renaming of the schools in San Francisco School District hasn't yet gotten through, so that might.
I think, in fact, it's about to not happen. And this thing in Chicago where you know, there was a board that came up with getting rid of. They wanted to take down Lincoln's statue, but not Stephen Douglas's statue. I mean, I wouldn't mind necessarily them taking down Stephen Douglas's statue, and not that Stephen Douglas didn't contribute in his way, but I mean, if you're going to choose people to take down, he'd be one of them, I suppose. But Abraham Lincoln in the land of Lincoln, I mean, you know, whether they're going to change the license plates too, are they going to change? You know, I mean, it was just crazy. I don't think that's going to happen there, and there may be I suspect there's going to be a backlash. You know, look, and I'll be frank in this audience, and we're being recorded, but that's okay. I mean, the problem also is the lack of, for want of a better term, in the ecology that exists now. There's not a place for liberals to be able to, real liberals to be able to, political liberals to be able to congregate. You know, I mean, if the fight's going to be between, you know, I don't know, a Quillette on the one hand and the nation, whatever on the left, you know, we're not going to, you know, it's going to be just both extremes are going to be arguing with one another, right? And there's plenty of responsible people on the right, conservatives, who have been saying things, but it gets dismissed too easily because, you know, it's coming from conservatives. Whereas my position, literally in this environment, is not supposed to be able to exist. And that's in part because, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. But, you know, in the old days, you know, maybe, I don't know, the New Republic might have been a place to do this, but the New Republic is not a place to be able to do this. There isn't a place for me and my friends to congregate. And not that I'm happy to, I congregate with everybody. So I'm not trying to be exclusive here. But what I'm trying to say is that in the spectrum of political opinion, if you see what I'm saying, there's a way in which the thing's getting polarized, and anybody in the middle gets melted away. But we don't have a platform to stand on, you know, and why that is another story. I hope that will change too.
Well, this is the platform to get organized. All you old guys, you have nothing to lose. You can't get canceled. Just do it. Tim has the next. Do you want to ask a question?
Well, while we're on this, I guess we really are on this.
Yeah.
What about Woodrow Wilson at Princeton?
Yeah. I mean, here's my thoughts about Woodrow Wilson at Princeton. I mean, personally, I didn't like the fact that it happened. Okay, but I can understand why it happened. But what my problem was the process as much as the outcome. I think that our president made a mistake, frankly, because when it first came up, there was a very exacting process that went on to decide what to do about this. And I know because I was consulted about it, and I told the people who were making the decisions, which scholars they should go to, who could be, absolutely fair, not either, hagiographers of Wilson or denigrators of Wilson, but people who are the real scholars. We all know who they are, the historians. And they consulted them. I know they did because it ended up in the report. And so I liked that. I liked the fact that, in fact, the university was acting the way a university should do. But now, in the wake of what happened, people were sort of freaked out in May. And then this happened without any consultation at all. The decision to revoke that original decision and then to take it down. I thought it was unfortunate, frankly. I don't think that Chris Eisgruber necessarily acted, I think he may have acted hastily. So I wish it hadn't been done then. Now, if we want to talk about what I think about Woodrow Wilson in Princeton, I mean, he was not a name I would have taken down. I mean, I know he's been demonized, and I can get into the history of all of that. We don't honor Woodrow Wilson. We wouldn't honor Woodrow Wilson for his views about African slavery, about Southern slavery. So when you see a statue of Woodrow Wilson, that's not the first thing we should see. It seems to me. There are many other things that he did that, all the reasons there are monuments to Woodrow Wilson in Poland or in Africa, those are the reasons that we see, right? And, whereas when we see a statue of John C. Calhoun, we don't see necessarily the same thing. So I'm not, an ardent preservationist, to the max, but I don't think that Woodrow Wilson would have been, I frankly, I don't get it, actually. I do get it, but I don't get it because of, what Wilson did, what Wilson's career was about. It's the beginning of the, it's not the one drop rule, but it's the one offense rule. I mean, you make any offense and you're going to be, you're going to be taken down. That strikes me as crazy, frankly, because it's fundamentally anti-historical and it's an attack on the past. And, as E.P. Thompson put it, what did he call it? The infinite condescension of posterity. No one is as great as we are, of course. We are spotless. I tell people, watch out, in 100 years, your name might be mud for the very things that you think are wonderful, or maybe some of the other ones that you don't think are so wonderful, but watch it. Be humble in the face of the future.
It won't take 100 years.
Yeah, huh?
It won't take 100 years.
No, it won't take 100 years. I agree.
Tim Brennan.
Yeah.
Hi, Tim.
Hi. Sorry, I missed the beginning of your talk, so I apologize if this is tangential. But I was wondering what the impact of Tocqueville, if anything, on the debate over slavery in the antebellum period in America was, or for that matter, of his friend Beaumont. I mean, I believe Beaumont had some effect. I'm not sure if Tocqueville had any effect at all.
Yeah, I mean, marginal. Tocqueville was obviously very anti-slavery in those immortal passages in Democracy in the second volume. But Tocqueville is essentially read as a commentary on democracy rather than about slavery, and not that the two are that infinitely separable, but it was much more his views about how the government operated, and he was both greatly appreciated, as you might think, and greatly scorned, but not around slavery. And also by the time 1835 then 1840, by the time the second volume appears, right, American politics of slavery had advanced. They didn't need de Tocqueville to get them arguing about slavery or thinking about slavery in the way that he did. The issue had already become so hot. But Yeah, I mean, thinking back, it was mostly like the Jacksonians, and they hated Tocqueville, and the Whigs loved Tocqueville, and that was kind of the way that it broke down in most of the reviews that you would see, you know, in the North American Review or the Democratic Review or in those places. It was mostly about that, you know, whether he was too hard on democracy or not, right? But slavery, not so much.
And Beaumont?
Didn't Beaumont write something after? I'm trying to remember. There is something of Beaumont's that I'm going to have to go back and see that ends up being more influential. That has more, you know, is mentioned more often. I don't know how influential anything is. They just mentioned because he was much more, you know, out there on the subject. But I'd have to check. But neither of them are major figures, in part because they're French. I mean, you know, by the time we're getting to the 1830s, 40s, 50s, America's fascination with France has kind of, you know, it's attenuated, shall we say. It would have been there in the 1780s, but not necessarily there in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s.
I have a question about the psychological profile, so to speak, the character of these early anti-slavery activists, as we would say today. It sounded like Sam Gordon, you described. Is there a type? Does it take, you know, it's a fantastic cause, but does it take a particular unsavory, weird human being to go against the grain that much?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Anna. And I'm tempted to answer it, you know, yes. I don't want, but I don't want to go that far. But off the record, I'd say, yeah. I mean, let me put it this way: it is to me remarkable how often or how many of the most effective and most fervent anti-slavery, they're even activists, writers. You don't see much of it, but also activists are, you know, what should we say? Ornery, difficult, weird, strange types. And the best example being, you know, a man named Benjamin Lay. Is that a name that's familiar to you all? Probably not. Benjamin Lay, I heartily recommend a biography of Benjamin Lay that's come out in the last 5 years, 6 years by my friend Marcus Rediker. Benjamin Lay was a dwarf, a Quaker dwarf who was and a vegetarian. And, you know, I mean, this is the side of, you know, it's the antinomian, you know, strange side, the underside, what should we say, the outside, the rebellious side of English Protestantism is, you know, this is Christopher Hill's world. But by the time you get to the beginning of the 18th century, they're, what should we say, they're outcasts, they're odd, they're weird. So Benjamin Lay, I mean, he ends up living in a cave. He's a friend of Benjamin Franklin's, by the way. Benjamin Franklin actually prints this absolutely indecipherable denunciation of slavery that he writes. And it, you know, it flummoxes every scholar that I know. It's impossible to read. However, he's also he's a performance artist. So, for example, one of the things he does, he kidnaps a slaveholder's child, right? And holds the child in prison in his house, such as it is, just to have the slaveholder understand what it's like to have your child stolen from him. Then he dresses up in a military guise. Now, mind you, he's all of 4'3" or something, and he goes into a church and he's accusing everybody in the church of being, a sinful slaver and all the rest of it. And he carries a book with him, right? And the book is the Bible. It's very clearly it's the Bible. And he's in the military. He's got a little sword next to him, right? And he goes up to the front. He interrupts the entire procedure, and he pulls out his sword and he starts, yelling anti-slavery imprecations and talking about what happens to the poor, the afflicted slaves. And he runs the sword through the Bible, right? And in the middle of the Bible, he's got a pig bladder that's full of pokeberry juice, which is very red. And he plunges it in, and the Bible starts bleeding like crazy all over the people, the front row, and all the rest of it. And this is political theater in 1739, whenever it was. He will lie down. During the wintertime, he would lie down in front of the church so that people could walk over him and say, "This is what you're doing. You're doing to me what you're doing to." So this is Benjamin Lay. He's an extraordinary character. But the others too, you had to be willing to put up with a great deal of abuse. You had, in order to get, because it's going to happen, it's going to come your way. And you also have to, do extraordinary things to get yourself heard. and your message is going to be hard enough. So, but I'm always reluctant to take a political position and psychologize it too much, or sociologize it even too much. I mean, this is what they used to do to the abolitionists. They used to do the abolitionists were all a bunch of status anxious cranks, and really there is a politics to it as well. But I do think that there's something to be said for early on, particularly in a political movement like anti-slavery. When it's 1650 and you're in the middle of the Coleman Street Ward and there's lots of other people around you, you can be like Samuel Gorton, who's a difficult man, but he's being appreciated by everybody. He said, everybody worships the ground I step. There's a community, right? Other times there's no community. And there, I think you're going to have, certain kinds of people are going to be much more likely at least to pick up the banner than others. I think that's right. But it is weird. Yes, there's Adam Sandiford. They're all pretty strange.
What about in the 19th century, the abolitionists with their zeal, their fervency, their violence, even John Brown?
Well, John Brown is a case that I don't want to tar the abolitionists with John Brown's brush. John Brown is he's Cromwell. I mean, in some ways, except an anti-slavery Cromwell. No, I think the abolitionists come in every shape. By the time we get to the 1830s, 1840s, 50s, I mean, they come in every shape, size, and they have been. I mean, in the 18th century, the abolitionists are very, what should we say, John Jay. I mean, they're very eminent, mostly Federalist types. So, but very active too. I mean, they're not just sitting around drinking sherry, saying how bad, or port, and saying how bad slavery is. They're actually, in the trenches, helping freedmen and slaves get through their legal travails, and they really are working very hard as they're working in the legislatures. But but I don't think there's a psychological type to the abolitionists. John Brown, however, is unfortunately the guy I always have to contend with, because I think John Brown did one great thing for the American anti-slavery movement, which was to basically get Abraham Lincoln the nomination in 1860. Because William Seward, who would not have actually been that great a candidate, in my opinion, was so disgraced because of John Brown that the convention ended up going to Lincoln, and Lincoln was the guy to do it. And in part, he owes that to John Brown. Lincoln also weathered the John Brown crisis very, very. He's a smart politician, and very, very well. But John Brown he's not that he was crazy. He was a fanatic. He's a fanatic, and I don't think that I have my opinions, my views on the abolitionists, but some of them are downright boring.
Harvey's son, Edward, is a Supreme Court judge in Iowa, and he's just informing us in chat that there's a bill pending in Iowa legislature. It got through a subcommittee to ban the use of the 1619 Project and reduce the school funding, I suppose.
Yeah.
But what do you think of banning this thing through legislative action?
I think that's a bad idea. I mean, I do. I think that this has to be fought out where it should be fought out. I mean, it's gotten politicized, right? And so that, Tom Cotton, came up with a proposal, which I had to write, and he had his history wrong too. But I wrote a piece in the New York Review, saying why Senator Cotton was off base. But of course, this gets politicized in real politics in ways that I think are unfortunate. I mean, first of all, I don't want the Iowa legislature supplanting me. I mean, not to be too egotistical about it, but I mean, it ought to be people who really know what they're talking about refuting this stuff, rather than to have it in a ham-fisted way. It will only, I think, encourage the other side. It only encourage the C-19 people. They'll scream censorship and all the rest of it. And they won't be entirely wrong, right? I mean, the people should be able to say what they want to say. There is a problem with school boards, however, and that's the nexus where I think things ought to be done. If you're talking about electoral politics, it oughtn't to be the legislature, it should be the local school boards, because that's where the rubber meets the road as far as education is concerned. And there, I think people should be putting all kinds of pressure on elected officials, as parents, as citizens, as historians, what have you, to deal with this issue. I think that's the appropriate place to do it, but not at the legislative level, because I think then, I mean, what Trump did with the 1776 Commission and so forth. I mean, and the thing he held. I mean, I don't know anybody on the commission. I know some of the people who were at that event in Washington. I just thought it was what? It's just about, there's nothing to do with history, that's for sure. It had to do with politics, and it's so implicated in politics that I don't think it helps the cause. And I do think there is a cause we all have in common, basically. I mean, and here here I'm talking about that missing middle. And I saw that at some point, Bill Kristol was on the call, but was here. But I mean, we've talked about this. There is this gigantic missing middle that has to now really assert itself, it seems to me. And how you do it, you're going to do it in a lot of different ways. But I don't think that politicizing it is the way, except with regard to school boards. That's what they're elected to do.
We can take a few more questions. Otherwise, there are some tangential things in chat. I have another question if nobody has one right now. It sounded like your research, what you're researching is a little under-researched at this point still. Is that correct or not? And if
there are more, fortunately, it's under-researched, but that's about to change. And I've been delighted to see, so many younger scholars looking at this from an angle that I find, illuminating, wondrous, etc. I mean, I wrote a piece in a new magazine that you all ought to be aware of. Actually, it's one of the it's a liberal magazine of all things. It's great, called Liberties Magazine. And I commend it to you all. And I have a piece in there about abolition and American origins. And I cite a number of the younger scholars. There's a man named Paul Polgar at University of Mississippi. There's a woman named Sarah Roning Sater at Penn. I mean, there's another name, Edward, Nicholas Wood. There's a bunch of them. And they're young. They're all, I'd say certainly under 40. And they're all in this field. So, nature abhors a vacuum. And I'm pleased to say that the vacuum is being filled. There are two books that have just come out. And I'll have a review of them in the New York Review soon enough. One about anti-racist politics. This is before the Civil War. This is a little bit later, but anti-racist politics in the North before the Civil War. And another about Black participation in the regular political parties before the Civil War. These run against the grain of everything that's been said. These are important new books. So I'm having to keep up more than I had planned on, and which is fine because then I don't have to do all the research myself.
Avi, you can have the last question.
Yeah, I lost internet for a while, so I don't know if you touched on this, but you mentioned earlier about intimidation. Mm-hmm. And by the very nature of the subject that you're working in, I would guess that there are people just waiting to accuse you of a misstep and mm-hmm. of having improper attitudes toward this sensitive subject.
Right.
And I'm curious as to what you've found as a historian with regard to colleagues who are intimidated from speaking out and
right.
letting the facts take them where they may.
Right. I mean, first of all, speaking for myself, I mean, I'm an old, chaired professor at Princeton, so no one's coming after me, I mean, if they are, they're doing it on Twitter. And, my view there is I don't mind, you don't matter. Mind over matter. I don't mind, you don't matter. And so I really don't care about that too much. So it's not going to affect me professionally or, I mean, I don't like I get some hate mail. I don't like, hate mail stinks, but I'm not worried professionally. What I am worried for are and I can tell a few stories, not completely out of school, which are worrisome. It's the younger and vulnerable people. I mean, it's the people I mentioned before who are working on this stuff. Most of them are just over the line. They've gotten tenure, they're okay, but not, but the people who haven't, every once in a while, I'll tell you one story. And it's anecdotal, so I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that there's a mass movement out there that's doing this, but it is anecdotal and it's telling. I was at one of the professional, conventions, right? Meetings, annual meetings. I can't remember which one. And a young scholar who I actually taught with here. He taught at Princeton for a while as an adjunct. Before moving on and has a good job. at a university job. You know, it's a bit like, you know, Moscow. It is a bit like Moscow 1935. I mean, people will come up to me. They know everybody knows who I am. So they, you know, they'll kind of come up, you know, make sure that no one's looking, and then they come up and say hello. And you know, the Moscow tick, where you're always looking over your shoulder. And what he told me was frightening. It was really frightening, because he said, "Look," I said, "Look," I was actually, this is early on. So why aren't you guys up in arms about this stuff? I mean, I know I know you know that slavery wasn't the cause of, you know, the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. I know you don't know that. Why isn't there more of a hue and cry? You know, why isn't everybody else revolting? And he said, he had one word answer. He said, Twitter. I said, Twitter? You know, come on. I mean, Twitter? Sticks and stones can break my bones. What difference does it make what people say about you with Twitter? He says, you don't have no idea. You don't understand that there can be, that if I am targeted by someone, it's possible for them to raise a Twitter mob and go to my dean and go to my chair and go to my everyone and have me, you know, pilloried. And I am deeply, deeply frightened about that. And I cannot let it happen. And in fact, this scholar did not even, you know, did not publish certain things, because he was told that until he got tenure, it was not, he could not publish it and expect to advance. This is frightening when I heard these stories. And that's the intimidation I'm talking about more than anything else. What's going on in the universities in terms of, you know, well, like the Smith story and all of that, that's terrible. It's awful. But there's something about stifling young scholars, you know, that really is, you know, cuts to the quick as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know what to do about it. You know, I mean, I don't know, because of it's not, you know, it's the social media aspects of all of this that have taken it to another level, right? I mean, I think the only thing that can be done is, you know, those of us who are protected, in effect, you know, just keep writing and keep pushing and keep, you know, giving people a place to rally to, and hope that this too shall pass, and it'll be all right. And I kind of have a feeling it will. I'm not overly alarmed, but I'm concerned by it. There's a lot of self-censorship out there. I mean, does anybody disagree? I mean, we've all seen it. I mean, I don't think it's anything that's empirically difficult. I mean, I'm not charging anything. I'm describing, and it's out there, and it's out there as a social fact. I mean, it's not there as a there's no conspiracy running all of this. It's not, it just feeds on itself. I hope that university officials will stand up to it better than obviously happened at Smith, to say the least. But that's going to require, you know, a lot more too. I mean, I feel like I'm pontificating, and I don't want to pontificate. This is a difficult time we're all in, and you know, my opinion is just about as good as anybody else's. And all I can do is tell my stories. So don't, you know. It's not that you wouldn't take it seriously, but it's just my opinion about all of this stuff.
Hey, Sean, it's 2:00. We need to stop.
Well, I could go on for a lot longer. I'd love it, but you know.
Yeah, it may be your opinion, but you've given us a reminder of what a wonderful thing a historian can be.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for your very good questions, excellent questions, and for keeping me on my toes. And for letting me, you know, for listening to my, you know, my first stab at all of this, which it very much is. Thank you very much.